This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 101 of Here's How for the 31st of March 2020. The housing crisis isn't going away just because of the COVID crisis. In this podcast, I talk to one campaigner about what actions might or might not make things better.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Coming up on today's podcast.
But there's no restrictions on paying for services. However, there are restrictions.
Wait up. When you say there's no restrictions for, what sort of restrictions are you referring to?
You hear talk of on and off balance sheet.
Okay. And so it would show up on the national debt. That's coming up shortly. But first, I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who does that. For people who don't know, Patreon is a website that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. That's a quote from the Italian chronicler Agnolo di Tura about the effects of the Black Death, which did a deadly circuit of Europe in the 1340s and 1350s, killing perhaps a third of the population or more. It returned at various intervals for centuries, causing more localized but sometimes just as deadly epidemics. But don't let that get you too paranoid. This disease can now easily be cured with antibiotics, which weren't available in the 14th century. Nevertheless, the Black Death is something that still haunts the culture of Europe and beyond. The Danse Macabre, with its awkward dancing skeletons, is still a common image, as is that of the plague doctor with the black gown and long beak-like plague mask. The southern German village of Oberammergau still follows a vow that they would faithfully perform a passion play, reenacting biblical stories, every decade if they were spared the plague that was ravaging the area in the 1630s. But even more influential, for an event that happened nearly 700 years ago, are the social and economic effects of the Black Death. The poor died more than the rich in the Black Death. There's a surprise. They died more because they lived in much closer quarters, allowing much more contagion, and didn't have the luxury of isolating themselves in castles or country houses. But in the years after the plague subsided, the tables turned. Feudal Europe's power structures were reversed when labourers realised that there was an abundance of farmland, all owned by the rich, and the food that it produced, but a shortage of workers. That shift in power dynamics in the market meant that peasants could negotiate a much better deal for themselves with the landlords they were previously tied to. This greatly destabilized feudalism and can be seen as the starting point for many of the changes that came in Europe in the following centuries. Some scholars even attributed the Italian Renaissance to the effects on society of the Black Death. That's above my pay grade, but it's not unusual for economists to attribute big advances in society and the economy to apparently destructive upheavals. The comparative success of the German economy compared to Britain in the aftermath of World War II is seen as ironic, given that the British won the war and the Germans lost. But it's not that surprising. The total destruction of Germany meant that old power structures were thrown out. To a significant extent, people who got rich in that period in Germany started out with nothing and got rich because of their talents and efforts. In Britain, whose class system was not disrupted by defeat, you got rich if your parents were rich. That meant that enterprise was rewarded in Germany, stagnation was rewarded in Britain. Not so surprising that Germany did better. It looks like we're going into another upheaval now, hopefully not nearly as dramatic, but even if the pandemic fades quickly, there are likely to be lasting effects. An obvious one is the way the governments, not least the Irish government, seem to have done things that they claimed before were impossible. After years of inaction and hand-wringing, all of a sudden, 560 places were found to house people who were sleeping on the streets of Dublin and other cities all winter. I'm reading some dire predictions of the possible death toll in the United States. I'm hoping they aren't true, but if those deaths are to be avoided, it will mean saving people's lives with hugely expensive treatment to people who are un- or underinsured, and the only way to do that is with federal government action. And once that's done, it's going to be difficult to argue that it's impossible to do. In the UK, the outgoing Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn claimed that the virus response had proven that he had won the argument in the election that he lost so spectacularly. He had won the argument for big government and big spending programmes. That's more than a little self-regarding. But he has a point that policies that governments, both in Ireland and the UK, were very recently saying were completely impossible, they're doing them now. Requisitioning hospitals, housing people who were sleeping on the streets, giving big cash handouts to people who've lost their jobs, banning evictions and rent increases. I don't think that we're in a Black Death situation here. We will get through this. Things will go back to normal. But it'll be a new normal, and it'll be a normal where arguing that nothing can be done about this or that problem, that argument won't be so easy to make.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line now, I have Councillor Alison Gilliland. She's the Labour Party member of Dublin City Council for Artane and Whitehall. She's also a chairperson of Dublin City Council's Strategic Policy Committee on Housing. And Alison, there's been a lot of comment about competition between Airbnb rentals and the private rented market for accommodation in Dublin and around the country indeed. Can you set out what's that exact issue?
Yes, over the last couple of years, we've seen the market for private rental really reduce, and as a result, rents have increased year on year, quarter on quarter, really. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is that an awful lot of apartments or houses that would have been rented out to the private market for families or individuals are being rented on platforms such as Airbnb for short-term rental, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a long weekend. And I suppose for the owners, the return is much higher than having a regular income of rent from a family or an individual. So because these apartment houses are now being removed from the private rental market, there is a lot fewer available for people who are looking for rental to put a home over their heads, as opposed to a tourist who's looking for a few days or a week to spend in Dublin.
Okay, so a lot of people might have used Airbnb who listen to this, but some people might not. But basically, you can go online onto their website and book as though you were booking a hotel room, book accommodation in whatever city you want to go to. And it's quite a popular holiday model that people get a Ryanair flight and an Airbnb, and that's quite cheap. So if you're a landlord, I guess, and you live in, your house, the house that you're renting is somewhere in the back end of Darndale, then you rent it. But if you live maybe close to a DART station in Howth or somewhere else that's either attractive to tourists or close to public transport that's attractive to tourists, then you just let it out for a multiple of the rental value, 1 week at a time, to people coming from all sorts of countries, maybe around Ireland as well. That's the model you're talking about, yeah?
Yeah, that's how it works. And I regularly check the Airbnb.ie just for Dublin to see what availability is like, particularly for whole units, whether it be the entire apartment or an entire house. And there's a huge amount on there, thousands, in fact.
Pause with that, Alison. Define huge amount in the context of Dublin.
In the context of Dublin, there are about 3, 4, maybe 5,000 apartments or houses on offer, full house, full apartment, in Dublin. So if you think of our rental market and the number of people who are always looking for somewhere to rent, and that means for them a home, not a week, not a long weekend, or not a fortnight or a month, those 4,000 to 5,000 houses or apartments generally back maybe 5-6 years ago would have been part of that private rental market. So now, because the owners can see more benefit, financial gain, in renting them out short term to tourists, as you say, coming to Dublin for a long weekend or a short stay, who maybe have family with them. And I can see the advantage. If you're coming here with 2 kids, it's easier probably from a lot of different perspectives to rent a house as opposed to book 2 or 3 rooms in a hotel. So there are advantages for the tourists, but the big disadvantage that we have seen in Dublin is in the availability, the huge reduction of availability of apartments and houses to rent at affordable prices to put roofs and homes over people's heads.
Okay, pause with that, because I think there are definitely issues with this. And one of the issues, which might not be immediately pressing for somebody who's just trying to get a house to rent, and rents have gone through the roof in Dublin and around the country in the past couple of years. We'll see if that continues. But one of the issues that's there is planning compliance, that if you live next door to a house or an apartment where somebody else lives, you just have a neighbour, then that's one thing. But if you have a different stag party in every weekend, I can see that A, that's probably not compliant with the planning regulations, and B, it might be a pain in the ass to have that type of coming and going. And there's a second issue, which is tax compliance. I'm not entirely sure if there's an Airbnb department in the Department of Revenue and how many of them are actually covered, and whether that's money just essentially just going into someone's pocket. And those are live issues, but the real one that you're concerned about is it taking away potentially homes that could be rented to people.
Yeah, that's correct. And you do raise the other issues with Airbnb. Tax is one, and lack of revenue not getting back into society. The planning compliance is something that we dealt with about back in June of 2019, whereby a regulation came in that if an owner was going to use an apartment or a house for more than X amount of days during the year, they would need a change of planning use from residential to commercial. Now, I think it's 90 days, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
However, from a Dublin City Council perspective, we if you compare what's available on Airbnb website, and obviously we don't know how many days per year those owners are renting it out or leasing it out for Airbnb. But there are, as I said, over 4,000 units on Airbnb. We have had, I'd say, maybe under 50 applications for change of use into Dublin City Council. So while people do own their Airbnbs, they're not, I suppose, complying fully with planning legislation. And the other issue you raised there was the inconvenience to the neighbours of having comings and goings always next door to you. And it's particularly pertinent for apartments, in apartment blocks where there's a special code to go in that only the residents in the block should have for security. I live in an apartment complex myself, and by the sharing of that code, it does leave a lot of families living in those blocks very insecure that that code is known perhaps all over the world, and could lead to people accessing the apartment block, perhaps even sleeping downstairs. Or
in fairness, Alison, most of these codes are pretty ineffective. You can stand outside for 5 minutes and then tailgate in on somebody going in or going out.
True, but from a sense of community and security within the apartment community, it does lead to concerns for people.
Sure, yeah, and that is a good point. If you have, let's say, 20 families in an apartment block, they all get to know each other. If 10 of those are actually Airbnbs and you have a new face coming up every time, you don't know whether that's somebody who should or shouldn't be there, and there's not the space for social policing there that there would be if that was all residents. And that's essentially what the planning is supposed to address. But the one thing that I really wanted to talk to you about, and I see that various people have commented on Twitter and other forums, and yourself included, and since the COVID-19 hit, there's been, I was going to say almost glee, there's been in many cases actual glee and delight at the supposed way in which the owners of these properties are taking a hit, and that some of these, there's been an increase of about 100 new apartments appearing on Daft, which is very much aimed at residential lettings and not at holiday lettings. And I just did a search for Airbnb in Ireland on Twitter, and there's just a huge volume of comments that are essentially hostile. It's a topic that's generating a huge amount of comment. And the thing I'm worried about, Alison, is I think you're being played. And one thing that I did was I went to the Inside Airbnb website, and this is not an Airbnb website. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular website. If you're interested in keeping track on what Airbnb are doing, this is what this website does, and it scrapes content from Airbnb. So in other words, it just automatically goes in. And you said 4,000 or 5,000. I can actually tell you exactly how many lettings there are today in Dublin on Airbnb. It's 9,437. But the one thing that I think is important to recognise is that when you see a house, like a whole apartment or a whole house available on Airbnb, in some cases that's because people went on holiday. And I know that because I've done it myself, that I'm going on for a fortnight somewhere else. I have a friend close by who I kind of trust to look after things, and I can let out my place in the time that I'm away. And clearly that's not something that would have been otherwise available to be rented to a family. You understand that point?
Yes, absolutely. And, it is a way, as you say, of keeping your house occupied if you're away on holidays. Mm-hmm. And that, I suppose, in modern times and the platform that Airbnb affords us allows for that. But I suppose the key difficulty we have seen with it from just a housing perspective is that people are not only using it that way.
Sure,
people
I
using...
accept that, but Alison, I'm sure you understand that the numbers here, the actual facts and figures are important. And according to InsideAirbnb.com, which seems to be reliable, I'll give it to you. Of the 9,437 in Dublin, if you can filter that, and if you only look at entire homes and apartments, so of course some people are letting out a spare bedroom, and also Airbnb is used by bona fide bed and breakfasts that they let out. It's a suitable format for them to get business for their bed and breakfast. So if we exclude that and only look at entire homes and apartments, you're down to 4,663. And if you then look at listings that are highly available, that's to say that are usually either rented on Airbnb or available to be rented on Airbnb, there's only 1,339. So of that almost 10,000 listings, only about 14% are actually entire homes that are normally being let on Airbnb. That's a tiny amount.
I think the entire homes amount, the 4,600 plus that you mentioned there, like for a family who's trying to put a roof over their head, an affordable roof over their head, every home counts.
Sure, absolutely.
And by reducing the number of available homes, it's the market of supply and demand kicks in, and then that increases your rents, which is what we have seen happen over the years.
Yes, so there's a shortage of rental properties, and that naturally supply and demand is one thing that puts up the prices. But hold on with that for a second, because you accept that listings that of properties that are only occasionally available do not fall into that category, and listings that, that only offer one bedroom in a house don't fall into that category.
No.
Okay.
No, having said that, it's interesting that the one bedroom in a house, because we do have the rent a room scheme, whereby owners can get 12,000 or can earn, let's say, 12,000 per year rent free. And we would have had a lot of students use that, single
so that's
people use that as well.
Long-term letting out a room. A lot of this was very popular for people who got a mortgage and got a two-bedroom place, and essentially your flatmate became your landlord. Okay, it's potentially possible that's in Airbnb, but clearly that's not the ones that are normally not available, that are only being let out once in a while. But the one figure that I want to go back to is in 2007, at the peak of the Celtic Tiger building boom, Ireland was building 90,000 dwellings a year. So in the context of that, 1,300 residences is only a couple of weeks' worth of building. So, in other words, if this was what was causing the housing problem, you'd just have to wait a fortnight.
Are you saying that if we wait a fortnight, that all these houses will come back into the system?
Not at all. But I'm just saying that if it was just the case that these 1,300 were what was causing the homelessness problem, or the availability of them would significantly solve the homelessness problem, then that's just a couple of weeks of building at the peak rate of building that we were at, and it's only a couple of months of building at the rate that we're building now. Okay.
I think I'd like to clearly state that Airbnb is not the cause of the housing crisis or the homeless crisis. But
Alison, I accept what you're saying, and I know that you've got a very educated opinion on that. But would you agree that there are comments on Twitter that are effectively saying Airbnb is responsible for people sleeping on the streets? That's over the top.
That's completely over the top. Absolutely. Our difficulty is housing supply. Mm-hmm. And if you go back, as you quite rightly said, in 2007, we were building 90,000 dwellings. And the we there is the entire, I suppose, housing sector. And that is broken down to social housing, so your council houses for those under a particular income stream. Then people who earn sufficient to get a mortgage and to buy their forever home. And then those who, for one reason or other, rent. It could be that they don't earn enough to buy, or maybe they're living with two or three friends in their early stages of their career, and they're not at that stage where they want to settle. So we did have a massive building explosion during that time. And then one of the things that happened from a council perspective, which is where the perspective that I deal with day in, day out, is that councils stopped building. Mm-hmm. And we had legislation that allowed the council take 10% or 5% of all building developments. But it also allowed councils to take finance in lieu of those units. Mm-hmm. So we weren't necessarily increasing our stock in line with our demand. And then when
pause on that. When you say finance in lieu, so does that mean essentially builders were buying their way out of supplying housing to the local authorities, Dublin City Council in your case?
Yes. There was a clause in that regulation that allowed the developer to pay, I suppose, an amount of money instead of giving the council the opportunity to buy the unit. So that was happening. Then it was under my colleague Alan Kelly that was changed, and that loophole was removed from the legislation, and it left the councils that 10% was only to be bought. You could not give finance in lieu of it. So that started, I suppose, a trickle of stock into the local councils. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, when you have, even with that, we call it the Part 5.
Yes. This was to have social housing mixed in with private developments. Yeah.
So it was to have that social or that income mix. Mm-hmm. But even though that loophole was blocked, building fell. So we weren't getting the supply of any type of residential building, whether social or private. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that is another factor in the rents, that the supply to meet the growing demand of a growing population mm-hmm. wasn't keeping on par. So there are a lot of different elements that contribute to the housing supply crisis we now have.
What I really want to do is, because, and I've done a couple of searches on Twitter on this, the Airbnb issue is causing a huge amount of activity and taking a huge amount of attention, be it on Twitter or whatever other public forum that this is being debated on. But Dermot Desmond, a strange person to write the article, but the article was fantastic, written in the Irish Times a month or two back, with suggestions to fix the housing crisis. And if somebody had written that Owen O'Brien had read the article, you couldn't really have seen anything in the article to disagree with them. It was a very advanced and very egalitarian suggestions for solving the problem, and I think very intelligent questions. And Airbnb wasn't mentioned in the article, but huge amounts of financial funds owning and not even bothering to let out rental apartments in Dublin and other places in the country. That's a huge issue. And it seems to me that this easy to understand thing of Airbnb being such a hot issue is crowding out public understanding of the fact of what these funds are doing.
Yeah, it's an incredibly complex sector. And as you say there, finance does come into it, where we get our finance from. The restrictions put on particularly the state with regard to investment in capital projects as opposed to services. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, we are spending millions on housing assistance payments to landlords because there's no restriction.
Just build with the money instead.
Yeah, but there's no restrictions on paying for services. However, there are restrictions.
Wait up. When you say there's no restrictions, what sort of restrictions are you referring to?
You hear talk of on and off balance sheet.
Okay. And so it would show up on the national debt. So basically, if the state were to pay over 10 years 100 million a year to private landlords to house people, that would not show up on the balance sheet as borrowing. If the state in year one borrowed €1 billion, in other words, 10 times 100 million, to build houses for those people, that would show up on the state's balance sheet and would look bad in terms of the debt to GDP ratio.
That is exactly it. And that is why at a council level, we are forced a lot of the time to partner with private developers, whereby there is a quid pro quo between land and units and building for us.
Mm-hmm.
And we would have seen that in the O'Devany project, whereby the government gave funding for 30% social housing, 10% affordable, which was affordable purchase, not affordable rental. And then the developer got 50% of the units back. So that reduced the appearance of the cost of that on the national balance sheet. So I think if you go up the food chain to European level, and it's at that level where we need to change the finance laws.
So these are European Union rules about what is and is not on the national balance sheet in terms of debt to GDP ratios.
Exactly. And that's where it needs to change. And that's where I suppose, our MEPs and our government need to really focus. And I think there is a general sense across Europe, and there's a campaign called Housing for All that is very much focusing on the financing, the state financing of housing, so that we can develop what I would call a public housing model that would allow anybody, regardless of their income, to rent from the state, whether that be their local authority or an approved housing body, and have the rent calculated in a way that is proportionate and affordable to the income of the householder. That's the model they have, for example, in Vienna, in a lot of the Nordic countries. But if we are to do that, we as a state need to invest and ramp up funding to build houses, which means capital funding.
Oh, okay. But deal with the issue that this whole Airbnb debacle over 1,300 potential houses that could be used for rental is getting a disproportionate amount of attention compared to the vast amount. So, for example, in Dermot Desmond's article, he talks about 420 hectares of vacant residential land held by the Dublin local authorities that could house 30,000 people. Are you sure that those two issues are getting a proportionate amount of attention?
No, I suppose Airbnb is easy to understand. An awful lot of people use Airbnb. They can also see, I suppose, the very tangible cause of the housing crisis, and that's people sleeping homeless in the streets, or family or friends who just can't afford the sky-high rents.
Yeah,
so
but,
it's very
easy
if we come back
to what's causing that, and you're right, it's a scapegoat. But my fear is that the root cause of that, which is essentially land hoarding, which Dermot Desmond writes about in great detail, and back as far as 20 years ago, in I think the year 2000, journalist Tom McEnany wrote about 8 individuals, 8 speculators owning 80% of all of the serviced housing land, in other words, the land ready to have housing built on it around Dublin, and the local authorities owning most of the rest. And essentially what's happening is that they are drip feeding the market to keep the prices sky high. Ireland has the lowest population density of almost any European Union country, yet it has the highest land prices. And there are people who are essentially making billions off that, and they're able to influence government decisions. And for example, when John Gormley was Minister for the Environment, he introduced an 80% windfall tax on zoning, in other words, to try and block people from hoarding land. And when your party got into government, that was abolished before it even had time to have effect.
I think with regard to the land, we have to separate it out into two categories. There's land that is owned by private individuals. Mm-hmm. And then there's land that is owned by the local authority. Mm-hmm. And actually, there's a third category. There's land that's owned by the state. For example, CIE owns land, the Office of Public Works. There is the vacant site levy. And that may be having an effect.
It's being implemented with the most lackadaisical enthusiasm of any tax I've ever seen.
I would agree with you that we need,
people end up, single mothers end up in Mountjoy jail for not paying their TV license. I don't think anybody has ended up so much as in court over that. And also the loopholes on that vacant site levy are ludicrous. If you just run a steamroller over a vacant site and put a gate on it and put a fella on the gate, you can say that it's a surface car park and you get out of the tax.
Exactly. I agree. Like we need to come down and have a particular compliance with that. And we also need to increase the levy exponentially so that it is not affordable for those who own it not to develop those sites.
But the bottom line is that your party's minister, Alan Kelly, was Minister for the Environment during a time when, number one, the windfall tax, this 80% tax to discourage land hoarding, was abolished. Almost as soon as it got into government, they abolished that. And number two, that vacant site levy, with all those loopholes that you can just put a guy on a gate there, call it a surface car park, and you don't have to pay a cent in the vacant site levy. That was instituted by Alan Kelly, your Minister for the Environment. Isn't it the case that when it comes to infringing on the interests of the super wealthy, the government, be they Labour Party ministers or any other ministers, are incredibly careful about doing it in the least inconvenient way for the billionaires and incredibly careless about leaving in loopholes that they can get out through?
Well, actually, if I'm not mistaken, when Alan Kelly got into office, he actually increased the vacant site levy.
Yeah, but left all the loopholes in. Nobody's paying this levy. This levy is not generating almost any funds at all because there are so many loopholes.
I can't say that. I think it's incorrect to say that no one is paying it.
Okay.
There are
Is
developers
insignificant
paying it.
Compared to the amount of vacant sites that we have in Ireland. Non-payment is the general rule.
Well, I suppose if you're saying there's a difference between non-compliance and
you're correct.
Using the legislation.
Non-enforcement is the general rule because A, it is difficult to enforce it. It is difficult to enforce it, and B, if an attempt to enforce it is made, it is very easy to wriggle out of it, and that's written into the law.
Well, then it's the wriggle room that needs to be stitched.
Sure,
in the sense that that's where the difficulty is. And I suppose and I don't make legislation, but I would imagine, and you quite rightly said, there are groups that would be lobbying governments and ministers when they're drawing up new legislation. I would also imagine you have to strike a balance between a carrot and a stick. And if you make it too stringent, then you may be doing yourself a disservice by completely disabling the developer from developing it.
How so?
One of the things
how so? Explain that.
And by saying, if you say, okay, if you have this site, mm-hmm. and it's not developed within 12 months, mm-hmm. the levy will go up to 7%. If it's not developed within 18 months, the levy will go up to 12%. and so on,
Hold on for a second. Alison, there's a perfectly easy way to sort that out, and it was in Dermot Desmond's article, and he referred it to it in terms of vacant properties, but it can be done for this. And he said that for properties that are being left vacant, you tax the person, impose income tax at half of the asking rent. In other words, whether you're getting the rent or not, you're paying income tax on the rent. And why on earth can you not tax that as though it were fully developed?
Well, I suppose that would be for
and so then you say, develop it, you go right ahead, take as long as you like to develop it. But by the way, from day one, you're paying the tax on it. So you bear the cost of the delay yourself.
Yes, that is an option. And I suppose they, regardless of what options you look at, you need to look at the unintended consequences of them all. Mm-hmm. Like the intention here is that land that is held in as private property mm-hmm. is utilised.
Yeah.
As opposed to left vacant.
Yes. So, but do you understand that there's an enormous incentive for people to leave land vacant where they own an enormous chunk of the available land? Because if those people, those 8 developers, 8 land hoarders essentially, who each own about an average of 10% of all the land in the city, if one of them sold 1/10 of their holding, that would be putting 1% of all the vacant land in the city on the market in one go. That would bring the prices down, and that's why they're holding on to it.
Yes, and again, it comes back to supply and demand.
And the demand and the supply is being constricted artificially. And our taxation system allows that, and no other taxation system in the world would allow that.
I agree.
And are you going to phone up Alan Kelly and tell him?
I'm sure Alan Kelly already knows my views on housing and what we could do. Although I don't know which one I'll be phoning up now at the end of the leadership election.
I won't press you to jump on either side of that fence, lest I cost you a job or favouritism. But we've gone on very long. Councillor Alison Gilliland, Labour Party member of Dublin City Council, also chairperson of Dublin City Council Strategic Policy Committee on Housing. Thank you very much for talking to me.
You're very welcome, William. Take care.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Alison Gilliland at Alison Gilliland. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.